Hello and welcome everyone to our MTI Live on regulatory routes. So how to bring MedTech innovations to market. Super excited to be joined today by five fabulous panelists with backgrounds in FDA and also startups and other mid-sized MedTech companies who are going to share what it's like from both sides of the table to bring these innovations to market. So really excited to talk about, different pathways such as a breakthrough device designation pathway, things like drug device combos and other unique aspects. So for those of you from our cohort joining in, please put in your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. As you're thinking of them, we'll be getting to those at the end. And for those of you joining from LinkedIn, thank you so much for joining us today. If you have questions that come up during the course of the panel, please comment those in the event link itself. We'll be sure to get to those during the live portion, this first hour here. So definitely ask questions for the panelists. This is your opportunity to do so. So I'm really excited to be joined here today by Doug Kelly, who is the Deputy Director for Science and Chief Scientist at CDRH in the FDA. He's also joined by April Marone, who's works specifically with the TAP program, Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program. So really excited to hear more about that from April. We've also got Christy Foreman here, who is the Senior Vice President of Quality and Regulatory at Drive DeVilbiss Healthcare. So excited to hear more about her work in that, and also has FDA experience beyond that to help guide. Miriam Provost, who's a Senior Vice President of Global Regulatory Affairs at Transmedics. And finally, Monica Ferrante, who's a VP of Regulatory Quality and Clinical at Vitera. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to each of the panelists to talk a bit about their backgrounds. Yeah, we'll hear from them for about a minute or so. And so hopefully this will be useful for you guys to start thinking of questions. So we'll start things off with Doug. Love to hear some of your background, Doug.
Sure. I'm Doug Kelly. I'm Deputy Center Director for Science at CDRH. I was trained as a physician and background in cell and molecular biology. I worked in a venture capital firm for 30 years and did early stage, seed stage life sciences investing in biotech, laboratory instrumentation, digital health, and in the end, medical devices. And then 4 years ago, when COVID happened, I got recruited to come to the FDA to be Jeff Sharon's deputy. And in the course of doing that, I helped negotiate the MDUFA 5 agreement, and then put together something called the TAP program, Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program, to try to bring stakeholders together that are required for commercialization at the beginning of the product development process. And one of the first people I recruited to help me put this together was April Marone.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. So April, love to hear a bit from you.
Great, thank you. Thank you for having me here. So my name is April Marone, and I am an advisor with the TPLC advisory program, working with Doug at CDRH, which has been a great opportunity. I've been with that program now for, I believe it's about 2 years, and I'm coming from a history being at CDRH as a lead reviewer, a team lead, and assistant director in our Office of Product Evaluation and Quality. I'm specifically on the obesity and hepatobiliary devices team. I come to FDA with experience as a research scientist, with my education being in physics and chemistry, and it's really great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us, April. Awesome. Christy, love to hear some of your background.
Hi, everybody. I'm excited to be here, and hopefully we'll have some really challenging questions. So start thinking about your hardest questions so that we can challenge this esteemed panel here. I'm anxious to hear what everybody has to say.
Let's keep the questions easy.
I spent 22 years at FDA. I started as a pre-market reviewer, and then I moved over to the Office of Compliance, and all of my experience in FDA is pre-reorg, so my terminology is somewhat dated. But I worked in the Office of Compliance as Deputy Division Director, recalls, warning letters, seizures, injunctions, quality systems, inspections, things like that. Came back to the Office of Device Evaluation as the Deputy Office Director and Office Director. Ultimately, I left FDA to join the ranks of consulting, where I got to work with a number of startup companies, including that's where I met Nicole Black. And And I got to see the challenges. So at FDA, you have here's the letter of the law and how and the expectations. The harder side sometimes is, okay, now how do we actually meet those expectations? I worked with a number of startups there. And then as Nicole mentioned, I am also the senior vice president at Drive to Build This Healthcare, but I do still maintain a consulting role as well with some startups and established companies.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christy. And yeah, I was super lucky to work with Christy in my previous role. So she has a lot of excellent expertise. I'm looking forward to her sharing. Next up, we've got Miriam Provost. Love to hear your background.
Thank you, Nicole. Yes, I'm Miriam Provost. I have kind of a similar background to Christy. I've been in regulatory affairs for 30 years, hard to believe. And I started out at FDA, and I was like Christy, I was a reviewer, but I spent my whole career in device evaluation, which is now called something else, but it used to be called device evaluation. And I similarly was a reviewer and a branch chief, division director, and then deputy office director. Then I left to do consulting, and I worked with small and large companies on everything from, pre-subs, IDEs, 510Ks, de novos, and PMAs. And then about, I guess it's been 7 or 8 years now, I took the leap and joined Transmedics full time. Transmedics, for those of you who don't know, is a medical device company. We have a very innovative device for preservation of organs for transplantation. And it's kind of a paradigm shifting device. Therefore, we're class 3 device. So I was at the helm there to get 3 original PMAs through FDA, all with panel meetings, all with post-approval studies. And so it was quite an experience. And in addition to the 3 original PMAs, we also have some 510Ks for different accessories. So working on this side, on the industry side, I have a lot of experience in getting an innovative product through when it's a class 3 device.
Yeah, thanks, Miriam. I'm really looking forward to hearing your feedback on PMAs in particular. A lot of our cohort is going down this route, so I thought it'll be super helpful. Awesome. And then last, but certainly not least, we got Monica Ferrante. Love to hear your background.
Hello, thank you so much for having me as part of this panel today. It's very exciting for me. I am an engineer by training and basically had a similar pathway, but a lot shorter time frame at FDA. So I started my biomedical career at FDA for a couple of years, and then I moved on to working for some larger companies. Hewlett Packard is one of them, which is no longer Hewlett Packard. I guess they're Philips now. That's the other part about working for dated companies is they all buy each other and change names 5 or 6 times. So it can be a little confusing. I worked for Draeger. I've worked for several smaller companies and a couple of startups. The last few companies I've been involved in PMA products, and my current position with Viterra, I've been here 4 years, and we are working on a class 3 device due to its novelty in taking care of premature babies. So lots of work to do there, and looking forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. Really important problem you're solving. So I love bringing that context in. Awesome. So for all you guys, the topic of today's panel is regulatory routes. And we've heard a bit from you about, some of the different pathways that you've taken medical innovations to market through. So, just like to hear from each of you, what are some examples of regulatory routes you've worked with and products specifically? So yeah, Doug and April, you want to start with that?
So with my background as a pre-market reviewer, I've reviewed every type of FDA submission that exists. Specifically, the area that I was in there was a lot of innovation in the obesity space. So a lot of investigational device exemptions and pre-submission discussions leading up to really the kind of more novel ways that some of those earlier technologies were going to be evaluated to meet FDA's regulatory requirements. And a lot of those turned into, de novos due to how novel the technologies were. They, were class 3 devices that led to being PMAs.
Yeah, that's great.
And I was involved with all of them, but on the other side, submitting them through, with companies. So I have my own scar tissue on them.
For sure. Christy, what about you?
So at FDA, I worked on all the submissions, PMAs, 510Ks, IDEs. I had the pleasure of, working on de novos before the program was fixed. While I was at FDA, we made the improvements to the de novo program that you didn't need to get that NSE before going to the de novo route, which I'm pleased to see that has transformed the de novo process and made it a much more usable program. And on the consulting side, I've done 510Ks, PMAs, de novos, IDEs, breakthrough device designations, the whole 9 yards.
Christy has got a lot of great experience in this. All right, Miriam, what about you?
Yeah, very similar to Christy and April. Working at FDA, I was a reviewer, branch chief, manager of every kind of submission there was. And then in consulting, I help small companies do their 510Ks and large companies. And then I did PMAs as a consultant as well. And I guess that you like to think that there's a simple regulatory submission out there. Oh, that'll be an easy one. But what I've learned that, none of them are really easy. There's always something that requires some thought and some careful analysis in order to make sure to explain that product well to FDA. And that's true regardless of whether it's a class 2 or class 3 product. But as you tackle a class 3 product, the areas of which you need to do careful analysis and consideration seem to grow with the complexity of the device. That's what I would say.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you so much, Miriam. Great. Monica, what about you? What routes have you worked?
Yes, a similar story. 510Ks, IDEs, PMAs, not as much experience in de novos, but getting that now. So yes, I think the processes are very much aligned with the complexities of the device and the novelty of the particular product that you're working on. And yeah, so the experiences kind of lead you from one step into the next as you go through the process.
Oh, thanks, Monica. So you all have, such a broad range of experiences working with these different regulatory routes. So, I'm curious, Monica, I'd love to hear from you on this. What factors are going to determine the regulatory pathway for medical device? I'm sure it's many things, but, anything come top of mind?
Yes, I think the first thing that you want to think about is how novel is your device. Basically, when a product idea is coming up, it's pretty obvious when it's very novel, which kind of leads you down a more complex pathway. But one of the things that it's really important to do is to investigate what the FDA has already looked at, what they've already cleared for market, to make sure that your device or some aspect of your device hasn't already been through that process and has information experience that you can lean on. Intended use is another thing. So while your device might be similar or the same as something else that's on the market, if you're talking about bringing in a different intended use that requires additional work, that's a consideration in terms of pathway and also the risk level of your device. And it's the beauty of de novo, right? If you're low risk, but there's nothing else like your product on the market, now there's a pathway that's a lot less onerous than a full PMA with all of the safety and pivotal studies that need to be done and so forth that can potentially bring the product to market much more quickly. Least burdensome for both the industry and for the FDA.
Yeah, keep in mind about the intended use thing is that intended use is it's a dangerous sword, because if you pick an intended use that you think gives you the easiest clinical pathway, it may not be particularly relevant to payers like CMS. And everybody else in the ecosystem keys off that intended use and the data used to support that. And if you then want to make claims about other things and you just have to rerun another study, you may have wanted to really, if you could do it over again, think about what intended use is really the one I really want to do. Because you're going to have to do multiple studies anyway to prove it works, especially if you don't have coding, and especially if you don't have an opinion from the RUC yet. These are all really important considerations.
Yeah, definitely good points. And I like, bringing up intended use if there's something already out there that's maybe, fitting this use as well. So a lot of our companies are creating brand new innovations, breakthroughs, one might say. And I know many of you guys are familiar with the breakthrough device designation. Do you have any tips for applying to this program? Miriam, maybe you have some tips.
Yes, so I have direct experience with the breakthrough program. We got breakthrough designation for 2 different indications for our device. And I will say, when we have an innovative technology, so making the case that it was breakthrough wasn't really difficult, I will say that. But then after we got the designation, it worked really well in one case, and it really didn't seem to translate to progress in the other case. And I think looking back, I would say it's because in the one case we had an FDA review team who's very familiar with the breakthrough program and were like ready to go and worked with us. And I think in the other case it was kind of new to them and they weren't really treating it as something that they weren't really understanding kind of the intention of the program. So I will say, so that's why perhaps it's a little mixed, but in the one instance, I will say it was outstanding and it was just really wonderful to work with the FDA review team. They really understood why this was indeed a breakthrough, and they did a lot to help us get it through in the most efficient way possible. I mean, we still did, don't get me wrong, we still did a randomized controlled trial, but working with them made everything go much more smoothly. So on balance, I would say it is something really worth considering. And because, getting the help, no, I wouldn't say help, but just getting the input and the guidance and the flexibility from the FDA review team is really very, very helpful.
Yeah, the really good advice. Thanks, Miriam. Christy, you have other advice add-on for this program?
Yeah, so, I've worked with a number of companies with breakthrough, and, we have a number of panel members here who have breakthrough designation. What I will say about the program is earlier on, it was a little bit easier to get a breakthrough designation. My experience now is FDA is being a little bit more conservative with the granting of breakthrough designations, just from my recent experience, in that they want more, it seems like they would like more data showing that benefit, showing that potential for benefit. So it can be challenging if you approach FDA too early and you don't have data to support what the benefit of this device would be. In cases like Monica's devices or Miriam's devices, the benefit is pretty evident there. And I think you can make arguments about, conceptually, you can argue without providing a lot of data, but some of the other devices need a little bit more data. My general rule when I talk to clients is, the breakthrough designation, for it to have benefit under the current program, you need to have at least 2 planned pre-submissions or more to have those sprint review discussions. Otherwise, I say that the juice isn't worth the squeeze, only because you have application and wait to see if you make breakthrough. And then if you only plan 1 pre-sub, then you really haven't gotten the benefit of the sprint discussions. So you need to make sure that you're going to have a number of interactions with FDA to make it worth the effort.
Yeah, that's really good advice, making sure you're in constant communication with them. And, we'll be talking about, pre-sub meetings soon. And so maybe this is something, to ask and discuss during one of these. So, one of these regulatory pathways that you guys most of you have experienced in is the 510(k) pathway, whereby you have, a predicate device with very similar indications of use. Do you have any advice on identifying appropriate predicate devices? And, how closely do the features and materials in these devices need to match your device to take this pathway? So Monica,
Nicole,
would love to, yeah,
can we go back to the
sure,
I know April had something she wanted to say about
sure, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Doug. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of add a little bit to, what others have said about the breakthrough designation program. So, Doug and I, we're with the Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program, which is not operational throughout all of CDRH at this time, but we did just recently expand. And one of the criteria to enter into the program is having the breakthrough designation. And, once you have that and meet, a few other criteria, that does give you the opportunity to then voluntarily enroll in TAP, where then innovators are assigned a TAP advisor like myself to work with them along with their review teams to not only do, well, we call them TAP amendments, but they parallel sprint discussions for regulatory topics, but to also work with innovators on what questions they have that are non-regulatory in nature and help facilitate then them having conversations with other parties that are working in that MedTech ecosystem space, such as, relevant professional societies, patients, and then of course payers and payer subject matter experts to really help them understand what are going to be those challenges as you move along the whole device development pathway and optimize those evidence collection strategies early to not only meet FDA's requirements, but everybody's requirements to get to patients.
And also breakthrough means something special to CMS. April, what do you know about that?
Well, now, TSET has been launched, and so that is one of the criteria to enter into their transitional coverage for emerging technologies program. So that is something also that innovators should be considering as to what extent that may fit into their reimbursement strategy, and what then would be open to them for having that breakthrough designation.
Yeah, thanks, April. Super helpful feedback. And I'm going to put a link in the chat to the Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program so that our cohort can look into that as well, especially if they're pursuing this pathway. Thank you guys for adding on to that. But yeah, Monica, I'd love to hear from you about, 510Ks, how you look for predicate devices and make sure that, it actually has similar indications.
Well, predicate devices are a very interesting concept. I think when I first started this whole process, we really didn't have access to an FDA website, et cetera, et cetera. So it was kind of difficult. But with the FDA's website, there's an opportunity to search the website and to determine whether or not there's already something classified that's similar to your product. I think the 510K summaries are a wealth of information. Comparison tables are typically in those so that you can see what your product might be comparable to and what other devices are out there. I think in terms of good predicates, again, going back to the intended use concept is sort of the place that you start. I think there's an expectation that with new technologies coming into the space that there will be technological differences, and the 510K flowchart gives you the opportunity to explain to the FDA what some of the similarities and differences are to the predicates that you've selected. And I think it's really important that in those comparison tables, you identify the things that are the same, and for the things that are different, that you are able to give a technological explanation and data to support why those don't introduce new questions of safety or effectiveness. So sort of an overall package.
Yeah, really helpful answer. Doug, April, do you guys have anything to add on to this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think I use maybe the same database that everybody else does whenever I'm trying to, help investigate predicates. But I'd really say, look at that flow chart. I mean, that's, the tool that is used. And if you can walk through that flow chart in a logical and reasonable manner, be communicating that to the FDA as to why you think you can, you can follow that regulatory pathway. And also be aware of the difference between a predicate and a reference device and how you can, use both of those to your advantage to make the argument if you feel like that is to be made to be a 510K. And I'd also like to just point out, I know there's sometimes some discussion about, okay, if we're not a 510K, but, de novo is the right pathway, is that really a more burdensome pathway for industry? And, I'd like to make the argument that that's not a bad thing to not have a predicate and to need to follow the de novo pathway. It's going to be the same, level of evidence to support your indication as far as, FDA is concerned, regardless if we're going to be looking at that through a 510K or a de novo. So I don't want that to be discouraging to innovators if there's not a predicate out there for them.
If this is a de novo and it's new, even though it's lower risk, you may not have coding. And again, you're going to have to run a bunch of data to prove that that it works for the indication in a relevant way to all the other stakeholders. So you're going to have to do the studies anyway. So don't get in a tizzy because suddenly you may have to do patients or do a bigger study. Everybody's going to be asking you for data. And in the old days where you did 3 hamsters and then sold your company to Boston Scientific, for a couple $100 million, those days are done. Now, Boston Scientific, all the big players look at your risk that is remaining after your FDA market authorization and saying that if I got to take on that risk, I'm going to take it out of whatever I'm paying for these companies. So then you get the giant earnout and what have you and get nothing up front. So you really got to think about, ultimately, what do you want to be? If you want to be a standalone entity and you want to control your own destiny, then you're going to have to invest in the data. That just takes time and money. And the question is how you do it to get the most bang for the buck. And in some cases, there's going to be a data set you're going to look at. And I'm not talking about just getting through the FDA. I'm talking about getting into commercialization and profitability. You're going to look at that path. You're just going to say it's not worth it. And you should find that out early rather than later after you put your mortgage and your kids' 529 accounts into your financing. It's much better to decide the juice isn't worth the squeeze after you spend $100,000 instead of $100 million.
Yeah, thanks, Doug and April. Super great to hear, your perspectives on even taking this pathway to begin with, which leads really well into my next question, which is why might a startup, decide to go down a de novo or a PMA pathway if 510K is possible? So April, mentioned the level of evidence is about the same. So what are some good reasons why someone might elect for a different pathway? Christy, love to hear from you on this.
Well, so the first thing is everybody has to remember that FDA chooses your pathway. So companies can put a position as to why they think certain pathways might be more appropriate. But if FDA has said a device is a 510K device, you can't say, okay, but I want to be a de novo or I want to be a PMA, and vice versa. If you can say I have a predicate and it's a class 3 device that's on the market, that's actually not a predicate. That just firmly establishes that you are in fact a class 3 device and need a PMA. So the real question comes down to, de novo versus PMA. If you don't have that predicate and you are in the de novo versus PMA bucket, obviously a de novo is, in my opinion, a better route because it is cheaper in terms of the user fee. So that's one thing, but in the whole ecosystem, that's kind of a drop in the bucket. But the other thing is the de novo doesn't have what I call the PMA mortgage. If you have a class 3 device, you are talking to FDA at least once a year in your annual report, but often multiple times a year because you have to report manufacturing changes, more minor changes that might not need a new 510K, might need a PMA supplement. So to support and maintain a PMA, it takes a lot more lift to keep that device going than a de novo, which you have your initial submission. And once that is granted, then you follow the 510K pathway.
Oh, thanks, Christy. Super helpful to have that context there. And so, there's so many things to think about when going through this pathway, obviously, hearing with the FDA, interacting with the FDA to hear their feedback. So when is really the right time to hire in-house regulatory experts? A lot of our companies are startups. And so wondering, when do they make this big leap of having, hiring, VP of regulatory, as many of your titles are, when's the right time to do that? So I'd love to hear from any of you. Christy, I know you're able to answer this one.
Yeah, so certainly. So, Monica and I met when she was hired as in-house regulatory. And before that, I was actually helping support that company. So I think, the question is, do you have a viable product and do you have enough? You need to basically keep that person busy full time. You don't want to hire somebody and not have them be busy. But you don't want to wait until they are, the need is there and then start looking because then it's too late. So you really need to kind of plan your trajectory and figure out when you need that in-house regulatory support, which is why you want to think about, am I a breakthrough or not? How much interaction do I need with FDA through the pre-sub process to decide, do I want to do a breakthrough designation? And what are the other levels of support? Doug has mentioned, CMS. So while most regulatory folks don't necessarily specialize in CMS decisions, the regulatory person, in my opinion, is kind of the linchpin to make sure that they bring in those other areas to help support the product. Because, it used to be the challenge was getting through FDA. Today, the challenge is, okay, getting through FDA is one step in many, but if nobody will pay for the device, and then you'll have a device that will die on the vine. So you want to make sure that you have somebody that's there to at least support the process and bring in additional expertise as needed.
Yeah,
Yeah,
really.
it's actually it's one of the biggest issues that we see at FDA is that oftentimes regulatory consultants are hired to be extraordinarily tactical, and they're given a mission, which is get me through the FDA as cheaply as possible, as quickly as possible. And oftentimes the regulatory consultants don't have purview into the larger strategy that the company wants to pursue. We even see that at big companies where oftentimes the regulatory folks aren't talking to the business strategy folks, aren't talking to their marketing folks. And so it takes a lot longer to get through the path to commercialization than it would be if you took a larger strategic view about what clinical data do I need to have for this indication. And then, what's my next steps? Am I going to broaden the indications? Am I going to acquire a company? Am I going to bring in new technology? Am I going to expand the technology that I have? And so that says that if you're going to hire regulatory counsel, make sure that they're in the meetings where you're talking about your larger commercial strategy, because just having them work on just the regulatory part is crazy. It's like saying I'm going to have a race car. All I'm going to worry about is the lug nuts, on the wheels. And I have the lightest lug nuts on in the race. It doesn't matter if you haven't planned a strategy for winning the race.
Yeah, I love that analogy, Doug. Putting together the most complete race car possible, and often need to be efficient, wearing many hats. So as you know, some of our panelists are even head of clinical and quality as well for this. Like to move in now to testing plans and how you go about crafting this once you know your pathway. So, Christy had mentioned, the FDA is gonna determine your pathway, but who actually determines the testing plan that's required for this? I assume it's a lot of conversation back and forth. So April, maybe you can weigh into this from your perspective, and then I'd love to hear from Monica and Miriam on the company perspective.
Sure, thanks. Well, with the FDA, it's really, a good idea to, we say come early and come often. And so, as you're working out what is the testing that I'm going to be doing to, support my indication for use, support FDA's regulatory requirements, it's a really good idea to be taking that to the FDA and making sure that we're in agreement with that testing plan. We do put out a lot of resources to help innovators kind of understand, what are we looking for. We obviously have plenty of templates and tools out there for, the main categories of what you're going to need to be addressing for FDA. And, I saw somebody with a question in the chat. I do want to point out, we just have draft guidance out now on if you're developing a weight loss technology, what we're looking for both clinically and non-clinically for testing. So ultimately, the innovator is going to be deciding what testing are we going to be doing. But, at the end of the day for FDA, we need to be agreeing that, those regulatory requirements are met. So I do encourage you to be having conversations early with the FDA to make sure that you don't get to the point where you're submitting your large submission and you find out that you're missing a big portion of your biocompatibility testing that is going to take a very long time to obtain. So
when you're a company, a founding CEO, there's a couple of relationships that are really, really important with your life, in your life. There's your spouse, there's your therapist, there's your priest, and then there's your lead reviewer. You should be looking at them all the same. They're really important relationships. They're humans. It's great to interact with them. The more you interact with them in general, the better. And the sooner that you establish a trust relationship with them, the better off you are. So that interactivity is really, really important. As soon as you make them out to be your opponent or somebody that you have to execute chess moves against, it's a bad way to go.
Really like the emphasis on their people and can help you, and so forming that strong relationship.
I can't tell you the number of times that I've heard reviewers come to me and say, "This is a really, really important technology. I really want to be. I want to see it be successful." Way more often than not, they're in your corner. They want you to be successful.
Sure.
Yeah, and to echo what April said, the most expensive testing to do is the wrong testing. So you lose time, you lose money. So especially if you're a novel device, this is where you partner with FDA and you bring your technology and you bring your proposed answer to FDA. Don't go to FDA and say, here's my technology, what do I do? That's not their job necessarily. It's here's my technology, here are the risks associated with my device, here's how I plan to test my mitigations of those risks, and get FDA to weigh in and see, is that enough to support initiation of an IDE, because there are different thresholds. So you may be able to start an IDE with a certain data set. Moving into de novo or PMA, you'll need a more fulsome data set. But you do want to go early and go often, especially for those innovative technologies.
Yeah, thanks, Christy. I like that back and forth conversation too. Monica, when you were developing testing plans, how much did this involve interactions, with the FDA to land on, final plans?
Well, I think to Christy's point, the first step is determining internally in your cross-functional teams, what do we need for engineering testing? What are we looking at for biocompatibility to come up with that proposal? And then through the pre-sub process, the benefit of the whole breakthrough therapy designation, we're able to put that information in front of the FDA and get them to weigh in. So are animal study protocols appropriate? Are we gathering the right data? Same thing for biocompatibility. We're going to test everything that we need to test, and the plan is this. And to get their feedback and to be able to understand and move forward with that plan makes things a lot easier on the other side when you do submit the information, because they've seen the plan, they have a good understanding of your product, and if you've performed to it, then it makes things a lot easier on both sides of the equation. But it always starts with internally the team that is working on the device itself.
Monica, do you mind sharing what supplement number you're on right now for your pre-sub?
21.
Oh boy.
We ask a lot of questions.
I see Miriam's face and she's like, you've got to be kidding me. I will say Monica's device has a lot of questions and a lot of interactions. And so Monica's technology is on the extreme end of interactions, but FDA has been so collaborative during all 21 of those submissions.
We could not be doing this type of a program without them. Absolutely. And I think it is one of those technologies, at least I get the sense from our lead reviewer, and actually almost everybody on the review team, that this is a technology that they are excited about. So we're all just trying to make sure that it is safe enough to move forward with it so that we can bring this product eventually to market. So it's been quite an interaction, and very successful one so far, I think.
That is so good to hear, and so good to hear the collaboration, even, 21 meetings down the road of everything going on, still progressing toward that end goal. Miriam, would love to hear from you about, testing plans you've developed, and in particular, any considerations for bench testing. So we're very familiar, with biocompatibility testing, clinical studies, animal studies for safety and efficacy, but what about other bench tests too? When might those be required?
Oh, yes. Well, bench tests are pretty much always required, but I want to take a step back and just, first of all, chime in quickly on the discussion, which has been a really good one, and emphasize what Christy said, which is that, there's a lot of information that's already out there. So when you come into FDA for either 1 or 21 pre-sub meetings, really put a lot of thought into what you think is the appropriate testing plan. Don't come in just asking, hey, what do you think, FDA? I personally do not think that's a good strategy. I think that FDA, they're very busy people. They have a lot going on. They expect us on the industry side to be putting our best effort into determining what we think is appropriate, because we know our device the best. So that's the one point. The other point is, the beauty of medical devices is there's a lot of information out there about what people who have gone before us have done. There's FDA guidance documents, there's SSEDs, there's 510(k) summaries. So I have found it to be very helpful and usually successful to leverage previous testing plans to the extent that I can. Sure, with an innovative feature, there's something new you might have to do. But a lot of the bench tests are kind of standard in some ways: electrical safety, shelf life, sterilization, EMC, software VV. So, I think that it might seem daunting if you've never done it before, but there's a lot of information already out there, and just leverage what exists and think about it yourselves and work with your engineering team on what your VV testing plan is, and FDA is going to agree with you if it's well thought out. At least that's what I have found.
Yeah.
Also, keep in mind two things. The first is that you don't want to put your FDA reviewer in a position where you want them to come up with a plan for you, and then if it fails, they can come back and blame you. So they're not going to put themselves in that position. So only the company can tell you. There's all kinds of ways to test things and what have you, but at the end of the day, some of them involve more downstream risk and some involve less. And the company is the only one that can say what risk tolerance that they have. And the second thing is that I got to put a pitch in now since we're talking about testing is for quality. If you talk to I talked to Kevin Loba, CEO at Stryker, a couple of years ago, and he said the number one reason they don't acquire companies is price. The very close number two is quality systems. And too often startup companies, instead of building a quality system from day one in a small way that's appropriate for the size of the company and growing it as the company gets bigger, they find themselves in the middle of an M&A discussion. And then it comes discussion of the quality system, and the guys are like, hey guys, let's build a quality system really quick because they clearly want one. You can't retrofit one quickly enough to make it work, or a robust one. And so you got to have this discussion. I'll tell you, the vast majority of venture capitalists have no idea what a quality system is or how to implement one. They just figure, oh, eventually I'll hire a manufacturing guy. He'll tell me what to do. You got to think about it from really, really early on. That will also tell you what kind of testing you should be doing.
I'm really glad you brought up quality systems, Doug. I think that we should touch on that for a moment. So, a lot of people are wondering, where to look for these requirements and how to abide by this. The FDA has the CFR 21 Part 820, but also ISO 13485. And I know there's starting to be some alignment on these requirements. So should a startup try to, adhere to both? What should they really look for to focus on first when developing a quality system as well? Chris, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So what I would say is that 820 and 13485 were pretty harmonized to begin with, but with the QMSR, they're even more closely aligned. And so that's going into effect in the future. But what I would say is it is not that difficult to build a quality management system that addresses both. So you should plan on addressing both. And to echo Doug's point, it's especially the conversations I've had with the startups, especially when it's a startup of like 3 or 4 people, I say, you need to get a quality system as soon as possible. And I say, you need to decide if you're doing paper-based or an eQMS. And I always advocate for an eQMS just because it's easier to maintain. But for many startups, that's a cost that they're not sure they're ready to undertake at that point. So there are systems out there, I'm not going to plug any particular system, but there are ones out there that have basically streamlined their eQMS for startups. And the price point is a lot lower because they know that really you need your design controls. And the reason why you want to start your quality management system and have your design controls is that helps you not only structure your test plan, structure your design process, but it also helps you develop the outputs of that process. So it helps you develop documents that you can then take those documents and put them in your submission. So you know that when you have your regulatory person who's trying to compile your submission, they have good documents to begin with, and they're not going back to remediate documents. So it is an early investment that pays dividends throughout the process. And as I say, it's not that hard to harmonize with both. So that's always my approach. As I say, you might as well build it for both.
Great advice. Thanks, Christy. Want to close out talking about testing discussions, about, clinical studies and especially the investigational device exemption process. So, when will the startup have to go through this? Will they always have to go through this? And what are some considerations when you're applying? So, I don't know, Doug or April, you guys want to talk to this process at all?
Go for it, April.
Well, I mean, if you're developing a device, it's going to need clinical testing to support FDA's decision. Then there's a good chance that you are going to need an investigational device exemption for that. In addition, there's other parties and along the device development pathway that may also require clinical evidence. So I think it's a good idea to be thinking about these things early and figuring out what is that development plan and what is going to be the testing that's needed to do that.
Thanks, April. Great. Anyone, Miriam, you want to add into this too?
Yeah, I would just add to what April's saying. So, the question of whether you need clinical studies, that's a big question that, we're just going to assume we've made it through that question and you've gotten the feedback from FDA that yes, you need clinical data for this submission. So then, assuming you need an IDE, there's so many things to consider. Really, I'll just say a few words about what I think is two things. One is, of course, you need to do that preclinical work, the engineering bench testing, biocompatibility, if it's applicable, electrical safety, EMC, all that, if it's applicable, because you have to demonstrate that the device is safe enough to be used in human subjects. So there is a good bit of preclinical engineering, animal type work that needs to be done. But then the thing you really want to talk, so that's one thing you want to talk to FDA about is here's my testing plan for my IDE. Does this look acceptable? In so many words. The second thing is the study design. And I'm sure that Doug can weigh in on this. That is so critical. And you really have to think long and hard about what type of study is going to suit not just get approved by FDA, but be one that the clinical community is impressed by, that payers are impressed by. So that's when you have to think about, what is the design? Is it randomized controlled? Is it a single arm? How long is the follow-up? What's the indication for use that you're going for? Because that in turn will feed into what is the primary endpoint, what are secondary endpoints. I mean, it's a very complex topic. We could talk for hours just about that, but I guess my bottom line message is an IDE is a very important step on the path to getting innovative product to the market. I mean, we've done randomized controlled trials for all of our products, and we're very clinically driven organization. So we had a commitment to doing those trials, and we follow patients for a long time in our post-approval studies, and it's a big commitment. But then having that data, as Doug alluded to, having that strong clinical evidence that your product is providing better clinical outcomes and is of value, is just sets up a company for success.
Let me tell you a common mistake that April and I see in TAP, and I'm sure she saw it as a reviewer, that you get these startup companies who have raised a limited amount of money, they're undercapitalized, they don't really have the structure to support a bunch of clinical studies, and yet they're hell-bent on rushing through a clinical study because I know exactly what we need to do. I don't really need to talk to anybody else, just want to get this done and get it over with. It's an insane mistake to not take the time to talk to patients to find out, although most company founders are either engineers or docs, and a lot of the docs say, I don't need to talk to any more patients, I've talked to all mine. But a lot of times they really haven't talked to patients about what endpoints really mean anything to them, what their risk benefit is through the course of their disease and demographics. And the most expensive and dangerous part of a company's existence is accruing your clinical study. It takes, if you do it wrong and you pick a bunch of endpoints that nobody cares about, it's going to take you forever to accrue the study, and you're just going to burn through cash. A lot of times that's an existential threat for the company. So rather than rush through to get through the study, while your burn rate is still low, take some time, talk to your professional society, talk about what data is going to help me get incorporated into practice guidelines. What will get me support for the CPT? I'm the first liaison from CDRH to the CPT editorial panel, and there's a page that when you show up in the documents that says basically who supports this and who doesn't. And if you don't have professional society support, or they're actively against you, that's a problem. You're not going to get a code. And if you haven't taken into consideration, does this fit into the practice of medicine? And is this going to cause my other codes and that I as a doctor that I commonly do these other procedures, they're going to get revalued with this new technology in the area, and they're going to get revalued down. And so if the volume of these procedures is going to make up for the revenue loss, they're not going to support it. So there's all these other considerations that you have to think about in terms of your clinical indication. It's not just as easy as like, well, I think it treats heart failure, my indication is heart failure. You really need to think about what patient population are you going for, what's the initial indication, what's that study going to look like, it takes a lot of thought. I know, April, you've seen a lot of this.
Thanks, Doug. And thanks, Miriam, as well for providing feedback on that. I want to get to some of our LinkedIn questions that were submitted. The first one, so this will be probably for you, Doug or April. What advice do you have if you're going for breakthrough device designation and the FDA review team doesn't have experience with this pathway?
Go for it, April.
Well, I think by now most review teams have had experience with the breakthrough designation pathway, but you know, if you're uncertain as to whether or not that is you know, applicable to you, if your indication aligns with the you know, criteria, you know, that's something that you can reach out to your review teams ahead of time through the pre-submission program to speak with them about if they do feel like, you know, this is truly a breakthrough technology that could save you, you know, some time before you put together that submission to then not have it end up with the decision that you'd like.
Yeah, thanks, April. Hopefully that was helpful for whoever is listening. Hopefully there is experience on your team. The next question is, what are the key regulatory challenges that startups face when bringing MedTech innovations to market, and how can startups best prepare to address these challenges? I'm sure there's a lot of challenges, but maybe Monica or Miriam, you guys can provide some specific challenges you've gone through.
Go for it, Monica.
If I can unmute. Yeah, I think the challenges are really the balance that we've spoken to earlier, and that is where to put your resources and where to put your efforts. Quality system obviously is a big one, and people don't necessarily think about it until a little too late. When to bring in the appropriate regulatory resources and so forth. I think. I mean, I've seen it a number of times where a startup company is raring to go. We have our prototype. We're going to go do a clinical study. And it's like, whoa, 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 step back a minute and think about these other things, because the aspects of this process that are necessary to actually get a product to market eventually include so many other factors that we've been talking about here today. So I think that's the biggest thing is take a step, as we've heard already, take a step back, take a breath when things are not quite so expensive, and figure out what your path forward is.
I agree. And I would add one thing, and I'm not a consultant anymore, so this is not out of self-interest, but I will say that really helps to talk to a consultant or hire a consultant who really understands the regulatory process and really understands, can kind of read between the lines of what's not written, because that's what experienced regulatory professionals can do based on their actual hands-on work. They know that, well, that doesn't actually mean that what's written there, or that guidance document is not being followed, it's something else. And, you know, if you don't get that feedback early on, you could really head down a path that is not correct. And then that's just wasted time and effort. We get oriented properly from the beginning and really come to understand what is the regulatory path that's ahead of me. That's so important right from the start. So that's what I would say is try to get in touch with somebody, talk to somebody, work with somebody who really understands the process.
Yeah.
And try to find somebody who's strategic.
Mhm.
No, the biggest problem we see at FDA is that consultants are either out of date and they really don't understand what the latest guidance is, and they're not really familiar with the current procedures, or they're too tactical. And if you've got a tactical regulatory consultant, you probably picked the wrong regulatory consultant.
Mhm.
In my experience, the biggest challenge is timelines. Companies developing timelines on the outset will develop very optimistic timelines that even if everything went right, it would be a very challenging venture to meet those timelines. And very often for innovative device development, things don't go right all of the time. You have to reconsider, you have to reassess. And so what I found is regulatory always gets the squeeze. Engineering takes longer to do the testing, the clinical study takes longer to execute, recruitment was slow, and then everybody turns around and nobody wants to hear it's going to take this long to go through FDA. So regulatory, can you take the time and throw this in overnight so FDA can get it? big mistake because you don't want to lose credibility with FDA. You always want to have high quality submissions. So you need to plan your timelines appropriately, reassess your timelines as they go along, and make sure that regulatory gets enough time to prepare a quality submission so the company always maintains credibility with the review team.
And in a company, the worst thing that you can do to a board of directors is surprise them. So your credibility as a CEO really depends on your ability to predict what the risk is and then appropriately structure the company, appropriately capitalize the company, and make sure your board of directors is on board with all this. So, don't come up with some plan that is going to be impossible to execute because you think you can do it in half the time and half the cost everybody else can. Be conservative.
Thanks, Doug. So that I think the common theme here is, getting aligned with the FDA. And, one of the common ways to do this, we've already talked about, pre-sub, Q-sub meetings. So want to touch on what you guys think is the right time to plan a meeting and what are some of your tips and tricks for preparing for meetings. So anyone want to take this first?
Well, I'll start. I actually have a sheet, a one-pager guidance that I send out to my clients, especially if it's their first pre-sub, to explain the do's and don'ts, what you do, what you don't do, how it should work. Most meetings are by Zoom, so it's a little hard to kick somebody under the table by Zoom if somebody starts going out in left field. So I always go over kind of ground rules that, you always want to hear what FDA has to say. And remember, you can go into that meeting and you can talk all you want, and FDA will politely listen, but you gained nothing out of that meeting. You are there meeting with FDA so that you can hear what they have to say. So make sure that you build in enough time to hear what FDA has to say, because, that's the most important thing at the end of the day. That's going to impact your product development. Then you always have roles like who is organizing and orchestrating the meeting, because you want to have handoffs to make sure the right person is answering a question. The last thing you want is for FDA to say, well, did you think about a clinical trial for this? And to have somebody in engineering say, oh, that's a good idea, we'll do that clinical trial. And the clinician there is like, no, we don't want to do that clinical trial. That's not in line with our indications. So you don't want to create that dichotomy in terms of one person at the company said one thing, one person said another. So you always designate who is speaking on which topic. And that way you have a key point focal person who is the one who you hand off and say, Dr. So-and-so, can you answer this clinical study question? If it's a bench testing question, engineering team, can you answer that question? And so you want to actually prepare your submission. Remember, FDA doesn't like new information for pre-subs. So don't all of a sudden throw up a new clinical study protocol and say, FDA, what do you think about this? That's not going to get you very far. So you always seek clarification on FDA feedback. You have a very structured meeting time and allow plenty of opportunity for FDA to ask questions and provide input.
Thanks, Christy. April, love to hear your thoughts on this too. What are your tips?
Yeah, I second everything Christy said. I would love to see that one pager, and that thing would be very helpful. I have seen that probably over 100 times, for especially when we would come in person. Companies would travel from all over the world to come in to meet with the FDA, and they would have great presentations set up, and they would run 55 minutes long when they came there to have a conversation about FDA feedback. And that conversation ended up being maybe 3 minutes because the meeting was over. So I do think that that's a very important point, is whenever you're setting up those meetings, to allow time to have that conversation piece, not just telling FDA, because we will very politely listen to your entire presentation and run out your time. The other thing I'd like to point out is that I don't see used very much is informational meetings. And I'd be interested to hear, what Miriam, Monica, and Christy think about these. But those are a type of pre-submission that are, just as they're named, is it's your opportunity to come and just give FDA information. So if you have that novel technology that you would like to maybe just get in front of your team, it's a little bit more challenging now that we're virtual, but we are technically open for business. So those of us that live in the DC area, we can still come to campus and meet with you. But to share what your device is, what your ideas are, and there's really no expectation on FDA's part other than to listen. So that is one option that's a little bit, I want to say maybe easier to prepare for. I mean, I'm saying that from FDA's point of view to, just kind of give that information to the agency.
I could follow up and say that we did do an informational meeting. We had come in with some of with our other products for lung and heart, and then we were developing our platform for liver preservation. And it was a new team. They weren't familiar with it. So we decided, you know what, we're going to bring this device in. So even though it's a big device but we did it, we were able to bring it into to the building. This was obviously before COVID. And it was great. So many people came, they clustered around the device, asked all their questions. We got to meet the review team and some of the managers in like a little bit more of an informal setting. And we just thought it was really helpful. And I think it really helped us through the review process because they had that better understanding of our device, which is pretty complex. And being able to answer their questions on the spot was just really invaluable.
Great to hear that you had a good experience with that, and hope that some of our startups consider that. I know, April, that you have to drop off, so thank you so much for joining us today. Really helpful hearing your feedback. And again, I put the link to the Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program in the chat. If you guys want to check it out, I'll also send it out to our cohort. I'll comment it on LinkedIn as well, so for those of you listening in can listen. Before we end the live portion, one other question came in from LinkedIn. Want to make sure we get to, which is how do the regulatory requirements differ between major markets such as the US, EU, and China? And what advice would you give to medtech companies to navigate these differences? It's a good question. So,
well, I can just I don't have any experience in China, getting a submission through in China, but we have our CE mark for our product, and we had it under the old MDD, and we just got recertified under the MDR. And under the MDD was pretty relatively straightforward and not that onerous. But under the MDR, it's been it was very challenging. And what has happened, in my opinion, is the EU government has issued these regulations without a lot of clarity for the notified bodies. So they really are struggling to keep up with the deluge of work, I will say. And on the EU side, it's not like when you pay a user fee at FDA, there's this expectation that that you're going to hear back at certain time points and the submission review will be finished by certain time point. But on the notified body side, there are no such commitments. So unlike days of old, I would say today, getting a product through in the US is preferred. It's much more straightforward. You know what you need to do, the time frames, and on the European side, it seems to me, having gone through it, it's much more uncertain.
I can give you some experience in my pre-FDA career where we were submitting to other countries, and I'll speak specifically about China. A lot of times in China regulatory authorities want to see the data on Chinese patients, the same way that sometimes when somebody comes with data from other countries, they don't really have the same demographic that we do in the United States. The FDA will often ask for an additional study. You can expect that if you're going to have a product, especially a product that you expect you're going to sell a lot of they're going to want to see Chinese data on Chinese patients, the kind that they're going to be treating.
thanks, Christy, anything to add to this?
Yeah, I can't echo Miriam's words enough that MDR is very different than MDD in terms of your post-market surveillance requirements, even things like your testing, things that you could have done in-house. They're looking for that was done at a test lab. And there's a lot more certifications and validation and independence to developing data. So you really have to have a plan associated with any EU market. Now, obviously, EU gets you all of the EU countries. And I think until 2030, you can use your CE mark for the UK as well. But then, there's other jurisdictions, Latin America. So that's another area if you want to consider. You've got Anvisa to consider. Mexico has COFEPRIS. And, I will say that I've been recently dealing with COFEPRIS for some licenses. And it's a world of difference in dealing with COFEPRIS versus FDA. You don't get to talk to them. They want to make sure there is no appearance of corruption. So you have to have your in-country representative who prepares your application and submits that for Mexico. Whereas, with FDA, you can prepare your own application, you can use a consultant, and you can talk to FDA. So you have to kind of plan your jurisdictions. The other thing to keep in mind is if you're going to the EU, there are things like translations. So every country you want to distribute into, you have to think about there's a chart of all the translations that you need for your instructions for use and your manuals. So it's the EU has gotten a lot more burdensome, and it is much simpler at this point to go through FDA in terms of what is needed in that submission. It's much clearer and it's much more straightforward at this point.
Thanks, Christy. And thank you to all of our panelists for providing insight on this broad range of topics. Really hope for all of you listening in on LinkedIn, you learned something today. And we've got our last one next week, MTI Live on clinical trials. So be sure to join that one if you're interested. Thank you so much to our panelists. We're going to transition into our cohort Q&A.